In this video, we're going to talk about the mathematical properties, and this is part 2 video. So in part 1, we talked about the associative property of addition, the associative property of multiplication, the additive identity property, the multiplicative identity property. We also talked about the commutative property of addition and the commutative property of multiplication. So in this video, we're going to talk about the last 4 properties that we have to learn in 6th grade mathematics. So let's first talk about the multiplicative property of 0. And 96 times 0 is 0. 0 times 1/2 is 0. So the multiplicative property of 0 is simply stating that any factor multiplied by 0 will have a product of 0, which we learned that way back in 3rd grade when we started our multiplication facts. The next property is the distributive property. And just like the word distribute means to pass out or share, what you're doing with the distributive property is that the number outside of the parentheses is multiplied, which shared, distributed, by each number inside the parentheses. So here we have 3 parentheses 5 plus 2 parentheses. We know, children, that would be equivalent to the 3 times 5, which we have right here, and then the 3 times 2, which we have right there. Our second example kind of shows the equation, I think it's backwards, but actually it's still a regular old number sentence. But what they have done is multiplied 5 times 7 on this side and added 9 times 7, which is when we took the this 7 and multiplied it by 5, and that's what we have right here. And then we took the 7 again and multiplied it by 9, and that's what we have right here. So the number outside of the parentheses is distributed, shared, multiplied by each value inside the parentheses. Let's move on to the additive inverse property. The additive inverse property states that any number added to its opposite is 0. We learned about opposite values during our integer and coordinate plane unit. So we know that if we started at -3 and added a +3, our sum would be 0. In 6th grade, we use negative and positive numbers mostly on a number line. So if you're getting questions like this, draw the number line to make sure you understand what the question is asking. Our second example is 20 plus a -20 is 0. So if you started at 20 on a number line and moved left to the -20, you would end up at 0 with those values. The last property, we're finally there. The 10th property, the final property that we have to learn this year, darlings, is a multiplicative inverse property. Multiplicative inverse property. And that simply states that any factor multiplied by its inverse equals 1. So for this example, we have 3 times 1/3 equals 1. Let's talk about why that makes sense. To change that 3 to a fraction, we just put a fraction bar and put the number 1 under it. So then we're going to multiply that by 1/3. Remember, with multiplying, we just multiply the numerators and denominators straight across. So 3 times 1 is 3. 1 times 3 is 3. If we have 3/3 of something, we know we have 1 whole. So once again, that's considered the multiplicative inverse property. Any factor multiplied by its inverse equals 1. Let's go ahead and solve, or show how we solved 1/10 times 10 equals 1. So we write 1/10. We have to write the inverse, or flip, or excuse me, we're not flipping. We have to write the 10, but turn it into a fraction by putting a 1 below it. We're going to multiply 10. 1 times 10 is 10. I love the way people are writing this down. And then 10 times 1 is 10. Well, if we have 10/10ths of something, we know we have 1 whole. Just like if I were to say, I ate 10/10ths of a pepperoni pizza, that would mean I actually ate the whole thing. I ate all of the 10 pieces of that pepperoni pizza. So, in conclusion, these are our properties. They're going to help us with our algebraic expressions and equations. And let's go ahead and do some more examples together.